In today's video, we're diving into a critical question. Who benefits from the current wars on the international and regional scene? Now, you might be thinking, Ahmed, isn't that a bit cynical? War is a tragedy. And you'd be right, it absolutely is. But unfortunately, even amidst the immense human suffering, some parties see opportunity in chaos. Like a contractor licking their lips after a hurricane, there are those who stand to gain financially and geopolitically from armed conflict. Think of it like this. War is a business, a rather grim one, but a business nonetheless. And like any business, it has its winners and losers. We often focus on the human cost, the refugees, the casualties, the devastated economies, and rightfully so. But what about the other side of the equation? Who are the shadowy figures in expensive suits, profiting from the fog of war? Over the next few minutes, we'll be pulling back the curtain on this uncomfortable truth, exposing those who benefit from bloodshed and instability. Buckle up, because things are about to get messy. Let's start with the most obvious beneficiaries: arms manufacturers. These folks are basically the Bob the Builders of war, except instead of adorable construction vehicles, they're peddling tanks, missiles, and fighter jets. And business, my friends, is booming. You see, every explosion, every bullet fired, every life lost translates to a boost in their stock prices. It's a cynical equation, but an undeniable one. A single fighter jet can cost upwards of $100 million. Now imagine a whole fleet of those beauties getting blown out of the sky. That's not just tragedy, it's a lucrative business opportunity. And who are these merchants of death? Well, they're not exactly household names, but trust me, they wield enormous power. We're talking about companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, BAE Systems, and their ilk. These giants operate in a global marketplace, supplying weapons to anyone with a checkbook and a thirst for destruction. But here's the kicker. These companies don't just profit from selling weapons, they also benefit from keeping the conflict going. Think about it. A negotiated peace treaty doesn't exactly scream, "buy more bombs." No, they need a steady stream of conflict to keep those profits rolling in. It's a vicious cycle. They lobby governments for increased military spending, fund think tanks that promote hawkish foreign policy, and even sponsor arms fairs that look like amusement parks for dictators, all to ensure that the taps of war keep flowing and their coffers remain overflowing. And let's not forget about the revolving door between these companies and the governments they lobby. It's not uncommon to see former defense officials taking cushy jobs with arms manufacturers, leveraging their connections and insider knowledge for a hefty paycheck. It's enough to make you wonder who's really calling the shots. So, the next time you see news footage of a bombing raid, remember, someone, somewhere, is probably popping champagne and toasting to a healthy quarterly earnings report. And that, my friends, is the grim reality of the arms trade. Now, let's move on to the puppet masters behind the curtain, the ones pulling the strings on the global stage, major powers. These countries, with their sprawling militaries and insatiable appetites for resources and influence, often view war as just another tool in their arsenal. They talk about spreading democracy, fighting terrorism, or maintaining global order. And maybe, just maybe, they believe their own propaganda. But let's be real, folks, there's always a healthy dose of self-interest involved. Take oil, for example. It's the lifeblood of the global economy, and control over its production and distribution translates to immense power. Is it any coincidence that many of the world's most protracted conflicts just happen to be in regions sitting on vast reserves of oil and natural gas? These major powers often back different sides in a conflict, supplying weapons, training, and logistical support, all the while claiming to be peacemakers. It's like a cynical game of chess, with human lives used as pawns in their geopolitical power plays. And it's not just about resources. Influence plays a major role too. By backing certain regimes or rebel groups, major powers can establish a foothold in strategically important regions, projecting their power and advancing their interests. They set up military bases, secure lucrative contracts for their corporations, and ensure that their preferred puppet sits on the throne. It's Realpolitik 101, and it's as cynical as it is effective. But here's the thing. These interventions rarely achieve their stated goals. In fact, they often make things worse, creating power vacuums, fueling instability, and leading to even more violence and chaos. But hey, who cares about the long-term consequences when you can secure short-term gains, right? After all, it's not like the politicians making these decisions are the ones living with the fallout. No, that burden falls on the civilians caught in the crossfire, the ones whose lives are upended by the whims of powerful men in faraway capitals. Now, you might think that in the chaotic landscape of war, groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda are just agents of chaos, driven by ideology and a thirst for blood. And while that's certainly part of it, it's not the whole story. You see, even these groups, as abhorrent as they are, understand the economics of war. They know that chaos is a ladder, and they're more than willing to climb it. Think about it. War creates a vacuum. Governments collapse, borders crumble, and law and order evaporate into thin air. This creates the perfect breeding ground for extremist groups to flourish. They exploit the chaos to seize territory, control resources, and impose their twisted ideology on the local population. But it's not just about ideology, it's about cold, hard cash. These groups need funding for weapons, recruits, and logistics. And where do they get it? Well, from the very chaos they create. War-torn regions are rife with opportunities for illicit activities: smuggling, extortion, kidnapping for ransom, you name it. These groups become shadow states, running their own criminal enterprises and profiting from the lawlessness they helped create. And it's not just about making money, it's about power. The longer a conflict drags on, the more these groups can entrench themselves, recruit new members, and spread their influence. They thrive in chaos, feeding off the instability and fear that war generates. It's a vicious cycle. War creates the conditions for these groups to thrive, and their actions then fuel the conflict, perpetuating the cycle of violence and instability. And the more powerful they become, the harder it is to defeat them, making the prospect of peace even more elusive. So, while we rightly condemn their brutality and barbarity, it's important to understand the cynical calculations behind their actions. They're not just mindless fanatics. They're savvy operators, exploiting the chaos of war to advance their own agendas and line their pockets. Okay, so we've talked about the folks who profit from the fighting itself, but what about the aftermath? Surely, once the bombs stop falling and the guns fall silent, things start to get better, right? Well, not so fast, because waiting in the wings, contracts in hand, and hard hats at the ready are the reconstruction companies. And believe me, they're not in the business of charity. Imagine a city razed to the ground, infrastructure decimated, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. It's a tragedy, no doubt, but it's also a blank slate, an opportunity to rebuild from scratch. And that's where the vultures swoop in. These companies, often with ties to powerful governments and flush with cash, descend upon war-torn countries like contractors after a hurricane. They win lucrative contracts, often funded by international aid or loans that the devastated countries can ill afford, to rebuild roads, bridges, power plants, and government buildings. But here's the catch. These projects are often plagued by corruption, overinflated costs, and shoddy workmanship. The money that should be going towards rebuilding lives ends up lining the pockets of corrupt officials and corporate executives. It's disaster capitalism at its finest. And who loses out? The people who need it most, the ones who've lost everything in the conflict. They're left with subpar infrastructure, a mountain of debt, and a bitter sense of betrayal. They become victims twice over, first by the bombs, then by the profiteers who swoop in, promising salvation while picking their pockets clean. It's a cruel irony. The very act of rebuilding becomes another opportunity for exploitation, another layer of suffering inflicted upon those who can least afford it. And the cycle continues. War, destruction, reconstruction, profit, repeat. War is a breeding ground for suffering. It shatters nations, tears families apart, and leaves millions displaced and vulnerable. And lurking in the shadows of this human misery are those who seek to profit from the most desperate. Human traffickers. Think about it. War creates the perfect storm for this vile trade to flourish. Millions are uprooted from their homes, fleeing violence and persecution, desperate for safety and a better life. This makes them easy prey for traffickers who offer false promises of work, shelter, and passage to safety. These predators operate in the shadows, exploiting the chaos and lawlessness of war zones. They prey on the most vulnerable women, children, refugees, the displaced. They're tricked, coerced, or kidnapped, then sold into forced labor, sexual exploitation, or even organ harvesting. And here's the truly sickening part. The very institutions meant to protect these vulnerable populations, like refugee camps or border crossings, can become hunting grounds for traffickers. They infiltrate aid organizations, bribe corrupt officials, and exploit the desperation of those seeking help. War also creates a demand for cheap labor. With economies in tatters and industries decimated, traffickers find a ready market for their victims. They're forced to work in dangerous conditions, for little or no pay, often subject to abuse and exploitation. It's a modern-day slave trade, fueled by conflict and greed, and it's happening on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. The UN estimates that millions are trapped in forced labor and sexual exploitation, generating billions of dollars in profit for the criminals who control them. So, while the world focuses on the geopolitical chess game of war, let's not forget the human cost, the untold suffering inflicted upon the most vulnerable. They become collateral damage, not just of bombs and bullets, but of a global system that allows such exploitation to thrive. Now, you might think that only those directly involved in a conflict stand to benefit, but that's where you'd be wrong. Because in the globalized world of international relations, even those who claim neutrality can find sneaky ways to turn a profit from someone else's misery. Take, for instance, countries that supply humanitarian aid. Now, don't get me wrong, providing food, shelter, and medical supplies to those in need is undeniably a good thing. But it also comes with certain perks. It bolsters a country's image on the world stage, portraying them as compassionate global citizens. It's a public relations bonanza, and let's be honest, who doesn't love a bit of good PR? But here's the rub. Sometimes, the aid comes with strings attached. It might be used to leverage political influence, secure favorable trade deals, or even gain access to valuable resources. It's a cynical calculation, using the suffering of others as a bargaining chip in the global marketplace. Then there are those who profit from the economic fallout of war. When a country's infrastructure is decimated and its economy is in free fall, guess who swoops in to offer loans and investments? That's right, those neutral countries, eager to exploit the situation for their own gain. They offer loans with exorbitant interest rates, knowing that the desperate government has no choice but to accept. They buy up valuable assets at fire sale prices, further enriching themselves at the expense of a nation struggling to get back on its feet. It's like offering a Band-Aid to someone who's just been hit by a bus. Sure, it might stop the bleeding, but it doesn't address the underlying injury, and it certainly doesn't come cheap. So, the next time you see a country touting its humanitarian efforts or offering a helping hand to a war-torn nation, take a closer look. Are they acting out of genuine altruism, or are they simply seeking to profit from the ashes of someone else's war? Understanding who benefits from war helps us see the bigger picture and the complex web of interests at play. We need to be aware of the forces that perpetuate conflict, the cynical calculations and greed that fuel the flames of war. It's not enough to simply condemn violence. We need to hold those who profit from it accountable. We need to demand transparency from our leaders, scrutinize the actions of corporations, and challenge the narratives that justify war and militarism. We need to support organizations working to expose war profiteering, promote peace-building initiatives, and provide humanitarian assistance without ulterior motives. The road to a more peaceful world is paved with awareness, action, and a refusal to accept the status quo. Let's choose to be citizens, not consumers, and work together to create a world where profit no longer trumps human life.